Chapter 7: Who's Interrupting? Issues of Dominance and Control. Here is a joke that my father likes to tell. A woman sues her husband for divorce. When the judge asks her why she wants a divorce, she explains that her husband has not spoken to her in 2 years. The judge asks the husband, "Why haven't you spoken to your wife in 2 years?" He replies, "I didn't want to interrupt her." This joke reflects the commonly held stereotype that women talk too much and interrupt men. In direct contradiction to this stereotype, one of the most widely cited findings to emerge from research on gender and language is that men interrupt women. I have never seen a popular article on the subject that does not cite this finding. It is deeply satisfying because it refutes the misogynistic stereotype that accuses women of talking too much, and it accounts for the experience reported by most women who feel they are often cut off by men. Both claims that men interrupt women and women interrupt men reflect and bolster the assumption that an interruption is a hostile act, a kind of conversational bullying. The interrupter is seen as a malevolent aggressor, the interrupted an innocent victim. These assumptions are founded on the premise that interruption is an intrusion, a trampling on someone else's right to the floor, an attempt to dominate. The accusation of interruption is particularly painful in close relationships, where interruption carries a load of meta-messages that a partner doesn't care enough, doesn't listen, isn't interested. These complaints strike at the core of such a relationship, since that is where most of us seek, above all, to be valued and to be heard. But your feeling interrupted does not always mean that someone set out to interrupt you. And being accused of interrupting when you know you didn't intend to is as frustrating as being cut off before you have made your point. Because the complaint, "You interrupt me," is so common in intimate relationships, and because it raises issues of dominance and control that are fundamental to the politics of gender, the relationship between interruption and dominance bears closer inspection. For this, it will be necessary to look more closely at what creates and constitutes interruption in conversation. Do men interrupt women? Researchers who report that men interrupt women come to their conclusion by recording conversation and counting instances of interruption. In identifying interruptions, they do not take into account the substance of the conversations they studied, what was being talked about, speakers' intentions, their reactions to each other, and what effect the interruption had on the conversation. Instead, mechanical criteria are used to identify interruptions. Experimental researchers who count things need operational criteria for identifying things to count. But ethnographic researchers, those who go out and observe people doing naturally whatever it is the researchers want to understand, are as wary of operational criteria as experimenters are wedded to them. Identifying interruptions by mechanical criteria is a paradigm case of these differences in points of view. Linguist Adrian Bennett explains that overlap is mechanical. Anyone could listen to a conversation or a tape recording of one and determine whether or not two voices were going at once. But interruption is inescapably a matter of interpretation regarding individuals' rights and obligations. To determine whether a speaker is violating another speaker's rights, you have to know a lot about both speakers and the situation. For example, what are the speakers saying? How long has each one been talking? What has their past relationship been? How do they feel about being cut off? And most important, what is the content of the second speaker's content relevant to the first? Is it a reinforcement, a contradiction, or a change in topic? In other words, What is the second speaker trying to do? Apparent support can subtly undercut, and an apparent change of topic can be an indirect means of support, as, for example, when an adolescent boy passes up the opportunity to sympathize with his friend so as not to reinforce the friend's one down position. All these and other factors influence whether or not anyone's speaking rights have been violated, and if they have been, how significant the violation is. Sometimes you feel interrupted but you don't mind. At other times you mind very much. Finally, different speakers have different conversational styles. So a speaker might feel interrupted even if the other did not intend to interrupt. Here is an example that was given by Candice West and Don Zimmerman to show a man interrupting a woman. In this case, I think the interruption is justified in terms of interactional rights. Female: so, you really can't bitch when you've got all those on the same day. But, I asked my physics professor if I couldn't change that. Male: don't touch that. Female: what? Pause. Male: I've got everything just how I want it in that notebook. You'll screw it up leafing through it like that. West and Zimmerman considered this an interruption because the second speaker began when the first speaker was in the middle of a word change. But considering what was being said, the first speaker's rights may not have been violated, although there are other aspects of this man's talk that make him seem like a conversational bully. Interrupting to ask the woman to stop leafing through his notebook does not itself violate her right to talk. Many people, seeing someone handling their property in a way that was destroying their painstaking organization of it, would feel justified in asking that person to stop immediately without allowing further damage to be done, while waiting for the appropriate syntactic and rhetorical moment to take the floor. Sociologist Stephen Murray gives an example of what he regards as a prototypical case of interruption, where someone cuts in to talk about a different topic when the first speaker has not even made a single point. Here is his example. I think that, do you want some more salad? This simple exchange shows how complex conversation can be. Many people feel that a host has the right, if not the obligation, to offer food to guests, whether or not anyone is talking. Offering food, like asking to have salt or other condiments passed, takes priority because if the host waited until no one was talking to offer food, and guests waited until no one was talking to ask for platters beyond their reach, then the better the conversation, the more likely that many guests would go home hungry. This is not to say that any time is the right time to interrupt to offer food. If a host habitually interrupts to offer food whenever a partner begins to say something, or interrupts to offer food just when the speaker reaches the climax of a story or the punchline of a joke, it might seem like a violation of rights or the expression of mischievous motives. But the accusation of interrupting cannot be justified on the basis of a single instance like this one. Conversational style differences muddy the waters. It may be that one person grew up in a home where conversation was constant and all offers of food overlapped ongoing talk, while another grew up in a home where talk was sparse and food was offered only when there was a lull in the conversation. If two such people live together, it is likely that one will overlap to offer food, expecting the other to go on speaking, but the overlap-averse partner will feel interrupted and maybe even refuse to resume talking. Both would be right, because interruption is not a mechanical category. It is a matter of individual perceptions of rights and obligations as they grow out of individual habits and expectations. Interruption without overlap. In these examples, an overlap, two voices talking at once, is not necessarily an interruption. That is a violation of someone's speaking rights. There are also instances where speakers do feel that their rights have been infringed on and may even feel interrupted when there is no overlap. An example of such an instance appears in Alice Greenwood's analysis of dinner table conversations among her three children, twins Denise and Dennis, 12, and Stacy, 11, and their friends. In the following example, Denise and Stacy have performed a verbal routine for the benefit of their brother's dinner guest, Mark, 14. This dialogue, which Greenwood calls the Betty routine, is one the sisters often perform together. Before they start, they get Mark's attention. Denise says, "Listen to this." "Mark, listen to this." Then Denise and Dennis announce, "It's so funny." But Mark doesn't agree. Denise, in Betty voice, "Excuse me, are you Betty?" Stacy, "Oh yes." Denise, in Betty voice, "Betty who?" Stacy, in Betty voice, "Betty, Betty, 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 Betty." Dennis, Denise, and Stacy laugh. Mark, "What?" Dennis, Denise, and Stacy laugh hysterically. Although this routine sparks delighted laughter from the three siblings, and on other occasions also sparked laughter among friends, Mark did not laugh and claimed not to get the joke. Denise and Stacy tried to explain it to him. Denise, "I said, Betty who? Like you say Betty Jones. Then she says, Betty, 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 Betty." Dennis, "Did anyone eat from this yet?" Mark, "No. What I was going to say was, can I try that soup? It looks quite good." Denise, "Listen, listen, listen, listen." Mark, "Say it in slow motion." "Okay." Stacy, "Betty bought a bit of bitter butter, and she said, this butter's bitter. If I put this in my batter, it will make my batter bitter. So Betty bought a bit of better butter too." Denise, "You never heard that before?" Mark, "No, never." Denise, "Seriously?" Mark, "Seriously." Denise, "It's like the famous two." Stacy, "Tongue twister." Mark, "No, the famous tongue twister is Peter Piper picked." Denise, "Same thing, it's like that one." Mark, "You keep interrupting me." In this excerpt, Stacy and Denise repeatedly cut each other off, but there is no indication that either resents it. They do seem to mind their brother Dennis's overlapping to ask about the food. "Did anyone eat from this yet?" because he's interrupting their explanation. Denise protests, "Listen, listen, listen, listen." The girls are supporting each other, talking on the same team. Most striking is Mark's complaint, "You keep interrupting me." This is intriguing because what Marx was saying when he got interrupted, "No, the famous tongue twister is Peter Piper picked," was actually an interruption of the girl's explanation, even though his voice did not overlap theirs. Same is true for the previous time they interrupted him. Just as Denise said, "All right, watch this," Mark began to ask, "Is it as funny as a—" But he didn't get to finish because Dennis laughed and Denise launched the routine as announced. So Mark's protest seems like a real-life instance of the humorous line, "Don't talk while I'm interrupting you." Mark also took an oppositional stance, even though he was really supporting rather than disagreeing. The girls just said that their tongue twister was like the famous tongue twister. If Mark had simply offered the famous tongue twister, Peter Piper picked a pick of pickled peppers, then his interruption would have been supportive, furnishing the end of Denise's explanation. Instead, he began by saying no, as if they had been claiming that theirs was the famous tongue twister. In this conversation, the girls were trying to include Mark in their friendly banter. Greenwood found, in studying her children's conversations with their friends, that the more interruptions a conversation contained, the more comfortable the children felt in it, and the more they enjoyed it. But Mark refused to be part of their fun by insisting on his right to hold the floor without interruption. Perhaps his being a few years older was a factor. Perhaps he didn't like being cast in the role of audience. Perhaps he felt he was being put down when Denise asked, "You never heard that before, Mark? Seriously?" Whatever the reason, Denise, and Stacy were doing the report talk, and Mark wanted to do something more like report talk. It is not surprising that Denise later told her mother that she didn't like Mark. Although Denise did interrupt Mark to tell him he had the idea. Same thing, it's like that. There is no evidence that she was trying to dominate him. Furthermore, though Denise and Stacy interrupted each other, there is no evidence that they were trying to dominate each other. There is, however, some evidence that Mark might have been trying to dominate Stacy and Denise, for example, by refusing to laugh at their jokes and rejecting their explanation of their verbal routine, even though he did not overlap their speech. So it is not the interruption that constitutes dominance, but what speakers are trying to do when they talk to each other. Overlap without interruption. Claiming that an interruption is a sign of dominance assumes that conversation is an activity in which one speaker speaks at a time. But this reflects ideology more than practice. Most Americans believe one speaker ought to speak at a time, regardless of what they actually do. I have recorded conversations in which many voices were heard at once, and it was clear that everyone was having a good time. When I asked people afterward their impressions of the conversation, they told me that they had enjoyed themselves. But when I played the tape back for them and they heard that people had been talking all together, they were embarrassed and made comments like, "Oh God, do we really do that?" As if they had been caught with their verbal pants down. In a book entitled Conversational Style, I analyzed 2.5 hours of dinner table conversation among 6 friends. Looking back on the conversation, some of the friends told me they had felt that others had dominated the conversation. And when I first listened to the tape, I too thought that it looked that way. But the accused pleaded innocent. They claimed they had not intended to dominate. In fact, they wondered why the others had been so reticent. Only by comparing different parts of the conversation to each other was I able to solve the puzzle. The inadvertent interruptions and the impression of domination came about because the friends had different conversational styles. I call these styles high considerateness and high involvement, because the former gave priority to being considerate of others by not imposing, and the latter gave priority to showing enthusiastic involvement. Some apparent interruptions occurred because high considerateness speakers expected long pauses between speaking turns. While they were waiting for the proper pause, the high involvement speakers got the impression they had nothing to say and filled in to avoid an uncomfortable silence. Other unintended interruptions resulted when high involvement speakers chimed in to show support and participation. High considerateness speakers misinterpreted the choral support as attempts to yank the floor away from them, and they stopped to avoid what to them would have been a cacophony of 2 voices at once. Ironically, these interruptions were not only the interpretations of the apparent victims, they were their creations. When high involvement speakers used exactly the same techniques with each other, the effect was positive rather than negative. Chiming in with speakers did not stop anybody from talking. It greased the conversational wheels and enlivened spirits. Here are 2 examples from my study that illustrate these two contrasting situations and the different effects of overlap on conversation. The first example shows overlapping that had a positive effect in a segment of conversation among three high involvement speakers. The second shows overlapping between high considerateness and high involvement speakers that disrupted the conversation. Though gender is not a factor in the overlap patterns in these conversations, understanding how overlap can work or fail to work is fundamental to making sense of the relationship between gender and interruption. Successful cooperative overlapping. The first example took place in the context of a discussion about the impact of television on children. Only 3 of the 6 friends were talking here. The 3 high involvement speakers, Steve, the host, Peter, Steve's brother, who was a guest, and Deborah, the author, who was also a guest. Peter made the statement that television has been bad for children, and I responded by asking whether Steve and Peter had grown up with television. It might not be a coincidence that I, a woman, shifted the focus from an abstract, impersonal statement to a personal one. Steve: I think it's basically done damage to children. That what good it's done is outweighed by the damage. Deborah: did you two grow up with television? Peter: very little. We had a TV in the concert. Deborah: how old were you when your parents got it? Steve: we had a TV, but we didn't watch it all the time. We were very young. I was 4 when my parents got a TV. Deborah: you were 4? Peter: I even remember that. I don't remember. Steve: I remember they got a TV before we moved out of the concert huts in 1954. Peter: I remember we got it in the concert huts. Deborah: chuckle: you lived in concert huts when you were how old? Steve: you know, my father's dentist said to him, what's a concert hut? And he said, God, you must be younger than my children. He was younger than both of us. This conversation includes many overlaps and latchings, instances where a second speaker begins speaking without leaving any perceptible pause. Yet the speakers show no evidence of discomfort or annoyance. All 3 speakers take turns that latch into or intrude into others' turns. In this conversation, Peter and Steve, who are brothers, operate as a duet, much as Denise and Stacy did in the earlier example. This example contains a clue to why high involvement speakers don't mind being overlapped. These speakers yield to an intrusion if they feel like it. But if they don't feel like it, they put off responding or ignore the intrusion completely. For example, when Peter is saying, we had a TV in the concert huts, I interrupt to ask, how old were you when your parents got it? Steve doesn't answer my question right away. Instead, he first finishes Peter's statement. We had a TV, but we didn't watch it all the time. Only then does he turn to answering my question. We were very young. I was 4 when my parents got a TV. At another point, Steve ignores my question. I ask, you lived in concert huts? When you were how old? Without even acknowledging my question, Steve simply offers a vignette about his father that the topic of concert huts called to his mind. Part of the reason Steve does not find my questions intrusive is that he does not feel compelled to answer them. Exactly the assumption that frees me to toss them out exuberantly. Another reason that the overlaps are cooperative is that they do not change the topic but elaborate on it. Unsuccessful cooperative overlapping. The success of this brief conversation had nothing to do with whether or not speakers overlapped or interrupted. It was successful because the speakers had similar habits and attitudes about overlapping speech. The next example shows a segment of the same dinner table conversation that was not successful. Peter and I appear again here, but instead of Steve, we are talking to David, who has a high considerateness style. David, an American Sign Language interpreter, is telling us about ASL. As listeners, Steve and I use overlap and latching to ask supportive questions. Just as I asked supportive and overlapping questions of Peter and Steve in the previous example. Here too, our questions show interest in what the speaker is saying rather than shifting focus. But the effect is very different. David: So, and this is the one that's Berkeley. This is the Berkeley sign for Christmas. Deborah: Do you figure out those correspondences? Or do David: I when you learn the signs, does somebody tell you? David: Oh, you mean watching it like Deborah? 'Cause I can imagine knowing that sign and not figuring out that it had anything to do with the decorations. David: No, why, you know it has to do with the decorations. Deborah: 'Cause somebody tells you or you figure it out. David: No, oh, you talking about me? Deborah: Yeah. David: Or a deaf person? Deborah: You. David: Me? Someone tells me, usually, but a lot of them I can tell. I mean, they're obvious. The better I get, the more I can tell. The longer I do it, the more I can tell what they're talking about, without knowing what the... Deborah: Huh, that's interesting. David: Sign is. Peter: But how do you learn a new sign? David: How do I learn a new sign? Peter: Yeah, I mean supposing Victor's talking and all of a sudden he uses a sign for Thanksgiving and you've never seen it before. All Peter's and my comments are latched or overlapped on David's, but only 2 of David's 7 comments overlap ours. Furthermore, these 2 utterances, one that was inaudible and one in which David said no, are probably both attempts to answer the first parts of my double-barreled questions. Do you figure out those correspondences? And 'cause somebody tells you? David shows evidence of discomfort in his pauses, hesitations, repetitions, and circumlocutions. When I played back the segment for him, he told me that the fast pace of conversation in general and the questions in particular had caught him off guard and made him feel borne in upon. It is difficult for me to regard this conversation in merciless print because it makes me look overbearing. Yet I recall my goodwill toward David, who remains one of my closest friends, and my puzzlement at the vagueness of his answers. Comparing this effect on David to the effect of my machine gun questions on Steve and Peter, I was relieved to see that machine gun questions had exactly the effect I had intended when used with other high involvement speakers. They were taken as a show of interest and rapport. They encouraged and reinforced the speaker. But when these questions were used with high considerateness speakers, they created disruptions and interruptions. It was not overlapping or fast pacing that created the interruption and discomfort, but the style difference. Style differences are the very basis of such terms as fast pacing and pausing. Characteristics such as fast pacing are not inherent, but result from the styles of speakers relative to each other. I might add that as a result of doing this research, I learned not to use machine gun questions or cooperative overlapping with people who don't respond well, a tangible benefit of understanding conversational style. Cultural differences. In my study of dinner table conversation, the 3 high involvement speakers were New York City natives of Jewish background. Of the 3 high considerateness speakers, 2 were Catholics from Southern California and 1 was from London, England. Although a sample of 3 does not prove anything, nearly everyone agrees that many, obviously not all, Jewish New Yorkers, many New Yorkers who are not Jewish, and many Jews who are not from New York have high involvement styles and are often perceived as interrupting in conversation with speakers from different backgrounds, such as the Californians in my study. But many Californians expect shorter pauses than many Midwesterners or New Englanders. So, in conversations between them, the Californians end up interrupting. Just as I was considered extremely polite when I lived in New York, but was sometimes perceived as rude in California. A polite Californian I know was shocked and hurt to find herself accused of rudeness when she moved to Vermont. The cycle is endless. Linguist Ron and Suzanne Scollin show that Midwestern Americans who may find themselves interrupted in conversations with Easterners become aggressive interrupters when they talk to Athabascan Indians who expect much longer pauses. Many Americans find themselves interrupting when they talk to Scandinavians, but Swedes and Norwegians are perceived as interrupting by the longer pausing Finns, who are themselves divided by regional differences with regard to length of pauses and rate of speaking. As a result, Finns from certain parts of the country are stereotyped as fast talking and pushy, and those from other parts of the country are stereotyped as slow talking and stupid, according to Finnish linguists Jaakko Lehtinen and Kari Sahavara. Anthropologists have written about many cultures in the world where talking together is valued in casual conversation. This seems to be the norm in more parts of the world than the North European norm of one speaker speaks at a time. Carl Reisman coined the term contrapuntal conversations to describe the overlapping style he observed in Antigua. Karen Watson borrowed his term to describe Hawaiian children's verbal routines in which they jointly joke and engage in talk story. Watson explains that for these children, taking a turn is not a matter of individual performance, but partnership in performance. Michael Moorman makes similar observations about Thai conversation. Ryako Hiyashi finds far more simultaneous speech among Japanese speakers in casual conversation than among Americans. Jeffrey Schultz, Susan Florio, and Frederick Erickson found that an Italian-American boy who was considered a serious behavior problem at school was simply chiming in, as was appropriate and normal in his home. All of these researchers document overlapping speech that is not destructive, not intended to exercise dominance and violate others' rights. Instead, it is cooperative, a means of showing involvement, participation, connection. In short, simultaneous talk can be rapport talk. Women as cooperative overlappers. Paradoxically, in the light of men interrupt women research, and most important for our discussion here, another group that has been found to favor conversations in which more than one person speaks at a time is women. Folklorist Susan Kalsick was one of the first to observe women's use of overlapping talk by taping a women's group. In reviewing studies that compared all male and all female interaction, linguist Deborah James and Janice Drakage found that of those reporting differences, the great majority observed more interruptive talk among the females. Linguist Carol Adelsky inadvertently uncovered women's preference for overlapping talk when she set out to determine who talked more at a series of faculty committee meetings. She found that men talked more than women if one person was speaking, while the others listened silently. But women talked as much as men during periods when more than one voice was heard at the same time. In other words, women were less likely to participate when the situation felt more like report talk, more likely to do so when it felt like rapport talk. Cooperative overlapping framed parts of the meeting as rapport talk. Following is an example of women in casual conversation overlapping in a highly cooperative and collaborative way. It comes from a conversation recorded at a kitchen table by linguist Janice Horniak, who was a party to the conversation. Jan and her mother Marge, who are from a southern state, were visiting relatives in the north, where Jan got to see snow for the first time. Peg and Marge, who are sisters-in-law, reminisce for Jan's benefit about the trials of raising of small children in a part of the country where it snows. Jan's mother raised her older children in the north, but moved to the south before Jan was born. Peg. The part I didn't like was putting everybody's snow pants and boots and Marge. Oh yeah, that was the worst part. Peg. Marge. And get them all bundled up in boots and everything, and they're out for half an hour, and then they come in and they're all covered with this snow, and they get that schluck all over. Peg. All that wet stuff and Jan. That's why adults don't like snow, huh? Marge. That's right. Peg. Throw all the stuff in the dryer and then they'd come in and sit for half an hour. Marge. And in a little while they'd want to go back out again. Peg. Then they want to go back out again. As in the conversation among Peter, Steve, and myself presented above, all these speakers in this example initiate turns that either latch onto or intrude into other speakers' turns. Like Denise and Stacy, and like Peter and Steve in earlier examples, Marge and Peg play a conversational duet. They jointly hold one conversational role, overlapping each other without exhibiting or reporting resentment at being interrupted. Horniak points out the even more intriguing fact that these speakers often end a comment with a conjunction and creating the appearance of interruption when there is none, as when Peg says, all that wet stuff and. Horniak claims that this strategy is used by many speakers in her family and is satisfying and effective when used with each other. She is criticized, however, for using this same strategy among others, who protest that it confuses them. They may even get the impression that someone who ends a sentence with and doesn't know whether or not she is finished. Why would anyone want to create the impression of interruption when there is none? One reason that speakers from some cultural groups leave little or no pause between turns is that they see silence in friendly conversations as a sign of lack of rapport. Overlapping is a way to keep conversation going without risking silence. I should note, though, that Horniak and the family members she taped do not speak loudly or quickly or all at once. Their overlaps, though frequent, are brief. Ending sentences with and is a way to achieve the appearance of interruption when there is minimal overlap. Though Horniak feels the strategy of creating the appearance of overlap by ending a sentence with and is peculiar to her family, others have commented that they know people who do this. At least one man I spoke to said that his mother, to his father's chagrin, regularly ends her comments with and that her mother and all her sisters do it too, but her father and brother don't. This man also considered this a family style. Although it clearly does run in families, the style seems to result from a combination of gender and culture. Gender and culture also dovetail in another example of the false appearance of interruption. William Laboff and David Fanshawe, in a study of a psychotherapy session between a 19-year-old patient called Rhoda and a social worker, show that Rhoda never ended a speaking turn by falling silent. Instead, when she had said all she wanted to say, she began to repeat herself. Her repetitions were an invitation to the therapist to begin speaking by interrupting her. Both client and therapist were New Yorkers, Jewish, and women. Cultural explanations, a mixed blessing. The realization that people with similar cultural backgrounds have similar ways of talking often comes as a revelation and a relief to people who thought they had personal quirks or even psychological problems. For example, a Greek American man I interviewed for a study of indirectness in conversation had been told by friends and lovers throughout his life that there was something wrong with him because he always beat around the bush instead of coming out and saying what was on his mind. He told me that his parents spoke that way, and I told him that I found that Greeks often tended to be more indirect than Americans, and Greek Americans were somewhere in the middle. This man was enormously relieved, saying that my explanation rang a bell. He went on to say, I see it as either something heroically different or a real impediment. Most of the time, I think of it as a problem, and I can't really sort it out from my family and background. I don't know if it's Greek, I just know that it's me. And it feels a little better to know that it's Greek. Viewing his family style as an ethnic style relieved this man of the burden of individual pathology, otherwise implied being different from most of the people he communicated with. But the tendency of people from similar cultural backgrounds to have habitual ways of speaking that are similar to each other's and different from those of people from other cultural backgrounds has had unfortunate, even tragic consequences. When people who are identified as culturally different have different conversational styles, their ways of speaking become the basis for negative stereotyping. As I mentioned earlier, anti-Semitism classically attributes loudness, aggressiveness, and pushiness to Jewish people, making a leap from ways of talking to character. For example, in a letter to Henry Miller, Lawrence Darrell described a Jewish fellow writer. He is undependable, erratic, has bad judgment, loud-mouthed, pushing, vulgar, thoroughly Jewish. The perception that Jews or New Yorkers, the categories are often fused in many people's minds, are loud and pushy simply blames the minority group for the effect of their style in interaction with others who use a different style. Anthropologist Thomas Kochman shows that a parallel style difference underlies the stereotyping of community blacks as inconsiderate, overbearing, and loud. When members of one group have the power to persecute members of the other, the results of such misjudgments are truly tragic. If cultural differences are likely to cause misjudgment in personal settings, they are certain to do so in international ones. I would wager that the much publicized antipathy between Nancy Reagan and Raisa Gorbachev resulted from cultural differences in conversational style. According to Nancy Reagan, from the moment we met, she talked and talked and talked, so much that I could barely get a word in, edgewise or otherwise. I suspect that if anyone asked Raisa Gorbachev, she would say she'd been wondering why her American counterpart never said anything and made her do all the conversational work. Of course, not all Russians or Jews or New Yorkers or blacks are high involvement speakers. Many use the style in some situations, but not others. Some have erased, modified, or never used such styles at all. No group is homogeneous. For example, the high involvement style I described is more common among East European than German Jewish speakers. But many Jewish speakers do use some variety of high involvement style in some situations, as do many Italian, Greek, Spanish, South American, Slavic, Armenian, Arab, African, and Cape Verdean speakers, and members of many other groups I have not mentioned. A word of caution. The juxtaposition of these two lines of inquiry, gender and interruption on the one hand, and ethnicity as conversational style on the other, poses a crucial and troubling dilemma. If it is theoretically wrong-headed, empirically indefensible, and morally insidious to claim that speakers of particular ethnic groups are pushy, dominating, or inconsiderate because they appear to interrupt in conversations with speakers of different, more mainstream ethnic backgrounds, can it be valid to embrace research that proves that men dominate women because they appear to interrupt them in conversation? If the researchers who have found men interrupting women in conversation were to analyze my audio tapes of conversation among New York Jewish and California Christian speakers, they would no doubt conclude that the New Yorkers interrupted and dominated the impression of the Californians present. This was not, however, the intention of New Yorkers, and crucially, not the result of their behavior alone. Rather, the pattern of apparent interruption resulted from the difference in styles. In short, such research would do little more than apply the ethnocentric standards of the majority group to the culturally different behavior of the minority group. In a parallel way, claims that men dominate women because they interrupt them in conversation accept the assumption that conversation is an enterprise in which only one voice should be heard at a time. This erroneous assumption has significant negative consequences for women. Many women, when they talk among themselves in situations that are casual, friendly, and focused on rapport, use cooperative overlapping. Listeners talk along with speakers to show participation and support. It is this practice, when overheard, that has led men to stereotype women as noisily clucking hens. And women who enjoy such conversations when they have them may later feel embarrassed and guilty because they accept the one speaker at a time ethic that is more appropriate to men's public speaking conversational style or report talk than it is to women's private speaking style, which emphasizes rapport talk. Juxtaposing research claiming that men interrupt women with my study of dinner table conversation provides a linguistic parallel but a political contrast. Jews are a minority in the United States, as are blacks and members of the other groups that I mentioned as having high involvement style. Minorities are at a disadvantage, but in a male-female constellation, it is women who are at a social and a cultural disadvantage. This transforms the political consequences of blaming one group for dominating the other. Most people would agree that women as a class are dominated by men as a class in our culture, as in most, if not all cultures of the world. Therefore, many would claim that viewing gender differences as cross-culture communication is coping out, covering up real domination with a cloth of cultural difference. Though I am sympathetic to this view, my conscience tells me that we cannot have it both ways. If we accept the research in one paradigm, the men interrupt women one, then we are forced into a position that claims that high involvement speakers such as blacks and Jews and in many circumstances women are pushy, aggressive, or inconsiderately or foolishly noisy. The consequences of such a position are particularly dangerous for American women of ethnic or regional backgrounds that favor high involvement conversational styles. The United States witnessed a dramatic example of just such consequences when Geraldine Ferraro, a New Yorker of Italian extraction, ran for vice president and was labeled a bitch by Barbara Bush, a woman of more mainstream background. The view of high involvement style as dominance taken from the men interrupt women paradigm, yields the repugnant conclusion that many women, including many of us of African, Caribbean, Mediterranean, South American, Levantine, Arab, and East European backgrounds, are dominating, aggressive, and pushy, qualities that are perceived as far more negative in women than in men. As a woman who has personally experienced the difficulty many women report in making themselves heard in some interactions with men, especially public situations, I am tempted to embrace the studies that men interrupt women. It would allow me to explain my experience in a way that blames others. As a high involvement style speaker, however, I am offended by the labeling of a feature of my conversational style as loathsome based on the standards of those who do not share or understand it. As a Jewish woman raised in New York, who is not only offended but frightened by the negative stereotyping of New Yorkers and Jews and women, I recoil when the scholarly research serves to support the stereotyping of a group of speakers as possessing negative intentions and character. As a linguist and researcher, I know that the workings of conversation are more complex than that. As a human being, I want to understand what is going on. Who's interrupting? The key to understand what is going on, at least in part, is the distinction between rapport talk and report talk. The characteristic ways that most women use language to create a community and men use it to manage contest. As a result, though both men and women complain of being interrupted by each other, the behaviors they are complaining about are different. In many of the comments I heard from people I interviewed, men felt interrupted by women who overlapped with words of agreement and support and anticipation of how their sentences and thoughts would end. If a woman supported a man's story by elaborating on a point different from the one he had intended, he felt his right to tell his own story was being violated. He interpreted the intrusion as a struggle for control of the conversation. For example, a man was telling about some volunteer work he had done as a cashier at a charity flea market. At the end of the day, there had been a shortfall in his cash register, which he had to make up from his own pocket. A woman listening to him kept overlapping his story with comments and expressions of sympathy, elaborating on how unfair it was for him to have to pay when he had been volunteering his time. As a matter of fact, the man had not been telling his experience in order to emphasize the injustice of it, and he felt interrupted and manipulated by the woman whom he saw as trying to take over his story. Her offense was an excess, in his view, of rapport talk. This brings me back to my father, and why he might take particular relish in telling the joke about the man who didn't talk to his wife because he didn't want to interrupt her. My father believes that only one person should speak at a time. As a result, he often has a hard time getting the floor in conversations involving my mother, my two sisters, and me since we overlap and do not leave pauses between our comments. He also feels that once he begins to talk, he should be permitted to continue until he is satisfied that he has explained his ideas completely. My mother and sisters and I feel that in a casual conversation among friends or family, it is acceptable to chime in when you know what others are getting at. If you are wrong, they are free to correct you. But if you are right, everyone prefers the show of connection and rapport that comes from being understood without having to spell everything out. My father's view of this situation surfaced some years ago when he was talking and my mother chimed in. He wistfully sighed and said to my mother, You have an advantage, dear. If I want to say something, I have to wait until no one else is talking. But you can say what you want whenever you think of it. For her part, my mother can't understand why my father needs special privileges to say something. Why doesn't he just jump in like the rest of us? And I can recall feeling as a teenager that listening to my father, who is an attorney, explain something to me was like hearing a summation to the jury. So both the man and women in my family feel oppressed at times by others' ways of talking. He, because he is interrupted and doesn't find the pauses he needs to enter the conversation, and we, because he forbids and eschews overlaps and won't just take part like everyone else. The women in the family value overlaps and interruptions as shows of involvement in rapport talk, and the man in the family values not being imposed on in report talk. And he approaches casual conversations at home more like report talk than the women do. Then what is the source of women's complaints that they are interrupted by men? Just as my sisters, my mother, and I expect my father to toss out brief comments like the rest of us, men who approach conversation as a contest in which everyone competes for the floor might be treating women as equals, expecting them to compete for the floor like everyone else. But women are far less likely to do so, since they do not regard conversations as contests and have a little experience in fighting for the right to be heard. Quite the contrary, Elizabeth Aries found that women who talked a lot in discussion groups often invited quieter group members to speak. Uncooperative overlapping. Whereas women's cooperative overlaps frequently annoy men by seeming to co-opt their topic, men frequently annoy women by usurping or switching the topic. An example of this kind of interruption is portrayed in You're Ugly Too, a short story by Laurie Moore. The heroine of this story, a history professor named Zoe, has had an ultrasound scan to identify a growth in her abdomen. Driving home after the test, she looks at herself in the rear view mirror and recalls a joke. She thought of the joke about the guy who visits his doctor and the doctor says, "Well, I'm sorry to say, you've got 6 weeks to live. I want a second opinion," says the guy. "You want a second opinion?" "Okay," says the doctor. "You're ugly too." She liked that joke. She thought it was terribly, terribly funny. Later in the story, at a Halloween party, Zoe is talking to a recently divorced man named Earl, whom her sister has fixed her up with. Earl asks, "What's your favorite joke?" This is what happens next. My favorite joke is probably, "Okay, alright." This guy goes into a doctor's office and "I think I know this one," interrupted Earl eagerly. He wanted to tell it himself. A guy goes into a doctor's office and the doctor tells him he's got some good news and some bad news. That one, right? "I'm not sure," says Zoe. "This might be a different version." So the guy says, "Give me the bad news first." And the doctor says, "Okay, you've got 3 weeks to live." And the guy cries, "3 weeks to live? Doctor, what is the good news?" And the doctor says, "Did you see that secretary out front? I finally fucked her." Zoe frowned. "That's not the one you were thinking of?" "No." There was accusation in her voice. "Mine was different." "Oh," said Earl. He looked away and then back again. "What kind of history do you teach?" When Earl interrupts Zoe, it is not to support her joke, but to tell her joke for her. To make matters worse, the joke he tells isn't just different, it's offensive. When he finds out that his joke was not the same as hers, he doesn't ask what hers was. Instead, he raises another topic entirely. "What kind of history do you teach?" Most people would agree that Earl's interruption violated Zoe's speaking rights because it came as Zoe was about to tell a joke and usurped the role of joke teller. But Zoe yields quickly to Earl's bid to tell her joke. As soon as he said some good news and some bad news, it was obvious that he had a different joke in mind. But instead of answering no to his question, that one right? Zoe said, I'm not sure, this might be a different version, supporting his bid and allowing for agreement where there really was disagreement. Someone who viewed conversation as a contest could have taken back the floor at this point if not before. But Zoe seemed to view conversation as a game requiring each speaker to support the other's words. If they had known each other well enough to argue about this later, Earl might have challenged. Why didn't you stop me when you saw I was going to tell a different joke instead of letting me go and then getting mad? Another part of the same story shows that it is not overlap that creates interruption, but conversational moves that wrench a topic away from another speaker's course. Zoe feels a pain in her stomach, excuses herself, and disappears into the bathroom. When she returns, Earl asks if she's alright, and she tells him that she has been having medical tests. Rather than asking about her health, Earl gives her some food that was passed around while she was in the bathroom. Chewing, she says, with my luck, it'll be a gallbladder operation. Earl changes the subject. So, your sister's getting married? Tell me, really, what you think about love. Zoe begins to answer. All right, I'll tell you what I think about love. Here is a love story. This friend of mine, you've got something on your chin, said Earl, and he reached over to touch it. Like offering food, taking something off from someone's face may take priority over talk, but doing so just as Zoe starts to tell a story seems like a sign of lack of interest in her story and lack of respect for her right to continue it. Furthermore, this is not an isolated incident, but one in a series. Earl did not follow up Zoe's revelation about her health with questions or support, didn't offer advice, and didn't match her revelation with a mutual one about himself. Instead, he shifted the conversation to another topic, love, which he might have felt was more appropriate than a gallbladder operation for initiating a romantic involvement. For the same reason, taking something off her chin may have been too good an opportunity for touching her face to pass up. Indeed, many of his moves seem to be attempts to steer the conversation in the direction of flirting. Who's driving? Interruption, then, has little to do with beginning to make verbal sounds while someone else is speaking, though it does have to do with issues of dominance, control, and showing interest and caring. Men and women feel interrupted by each other because of the differences in what they are trying to accomplish with talk. Men who approach conversation as a contest are likely to extend effort not to support the other's talk, but to lead the conversation in another direction. Perhaps one in which they can take center stage by telling a story or joke or displaying knowledge. But in doing so, they expect their conversational partners to mount resistance. Women who yield to these efforts do so not because they are weak or insecure or deferential, but because they have little experience in deflecting attempts to grab the conversational wheel. They see steering the conversation in a different direction not as a move in a game, but as a violation of the rules of the game. Being blamed for interrupting when you know you didn't mean to is as frustrating as feeling interrupted. Nothing is more disappointing in a close relationship than being accused of bad intentions when you know your intentions were good, especially by someone you love who should understand you, if anyone does. Women's effusion of support can be irritating to men who would rather meet with verbal sparring. And a left jab meant in the spirit of sparring can become a knockout if your opponent's fists are not raised to fight.